Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening, and a huge thank you to us for kindly volunteering their time to be with us here today. Jazakumullah khairan, Sheikh Navaid and Menahal. We're really grateful for you guys to be joining us. So just for a quick introduction and some general notes before we get started, my name is Wada Taha, and I'm joined by my colleague and good friend, Mahnur Khan, and we're going to be your hosts for today's panel, inshallah. We're both graduate students currently at the University of Calgary, and we're both studying our Masters of Counseling Psychology. So we both have a strong interest, inshallah, for working in the Muslim community as psychologists with individuals, couples, and families in the near future. And so this kind of all relates to why we're having this panel discussion today, because we've had multiple discussions with family members or friends, people within our circles in the community who have these questions related to marriage, mental health, and just navigating relationships. And so our intention was to bring together two experts in their respective fields to answer such questions. And so with that, we'd also like to thank everyone who took the time to submit questions for this panel. So these are the questions that we're going to prioritize today, inshallah, and get those answered. And if we have time at the end, we will kind of go over some questions that you guys can submit through the Q&A box just right at the bottom of your screens through Zoom. But to respect everyone's time, we are going to really try hard to end at 6:30, inshallah. This goes for about an hour and a half. So with that, I will pass it on to Mahnur to introduce our guest panelists, and then we'll jump right into questions after that.
Yeah, thanks for that. So our first panelist is Sheikh Navaid Aziz. Sheikh Navaid is a Canadian Muslim public figure with a diverse academic and social background. He was raised in Montreal, Quebec, where he completed a diploma in commerce and social studies from Champlain College before heading to the Islamic University in Medina.
Noor, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but can you be a little bit louder?
Yeah.
I'm not hearing her.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no worries. Is that better?
Yeah, it's a little bit better.
Yeah, okay. Here, I'll move closer. Okay, so our first panelist is Sheikh Navaid Aziz. He is a Canadian Muslim public figure with a diverse academic and social background. He was raised in Montreal, Quebec, where he completed a diploma in commerce and social sciences from Champlain College before heading to the Islamic University Medina, where he completed an associate's degree in Arabic language and literature and a bachelor's degree in Islamic law. Upon returning home to Canada, Sheikh Navaid began teaching for Al-Malhab Institute, and since then he's transitioned to their Director of Public Relations. During this period, he volunteered as the Islamic editor for Little Explorers magazine and began his work as a youth and family counselor. In 2012, Sheikh Navaid moved to Calgary, Alberta to become the Director of Religious and Social Services for the Islamic Society of Calgary, a position he currently holds. In 2015, Sheikh Navaid became the first ever Muslim chaplain with the Calgary Police Services. The second panelist we have here today is Sister Menahal Begawala. She's a licensed mental health counselor in New York. She completed her undergraduate and graduate education at New York University in general and special education and literacy education, and then she completed a master's in clinical mental health counseling. Menahal has also completed the program of study at the Al-Huda Institute and continued her studies in Egypt and various Islamic organizations afterwards. Throughout her travels and studies, Menahal's passion is to bring awareness of mental health and wellness to the community through an Islamic lens. She conducts workshops on parenting, wellness, marriage, and addictions, amongst others. Menahal has completed her marriage counseling training through the Gottman Institute, and she's partnered with the Institute to author the Islamic reference guide for the Gottman method. Currently, Menahal has a private practice where she works as a mental health counselor covering a client base with a broad range of mental health issues and trauma through individual, family, and couples therapy. So thank you so much to our two panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us here today. So with that being said, we'll just jump right into the questions, inshallah. So the first question, the first set of questions are addressed to both Sheikh Navaid and Sister Menahal. So the first question is, what qualities should one look for when seeking a spouse? And what are some factors that can be overlooked versus those that are non-negotiable? So factors such as physical attraction, education, job, ethnicity. So either Sheikh Navaid or Sister Menahal, one of you guys can start, inshallah.
Sister Menahal, please go ahead.
I thought you were going to go ahead and start.
I insist, please go ahead, inshallah.
Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So this is a good question, and I think the standard answer to this question of what a person should look for, usually people say, okay, make your non-negotiables, education, this, that, looks, and standards like that. However, I'm going to go a little bit of a different route. One of the things that I see that is an absolute non-negotiable across the board is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has outlined in the Quran, in Surah Al-Rum, in the ayah that we see on every marriage invitation, right? The first piece, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He has created spouses for you لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, so that you can get sukoon from one another. And one piece of this word that, لِتَسْكُنُوا, a piece of that is that concept of safety. And safety is an absolute non-negotiable in a relationship. So you can have someone who is as educated as you want them to be, or comes from a particular place or family background or particular job, they could be the best looking person in your eyes. But if they speak to you in a way, or they criticize you in a way, or there's something that tells you that I am not safe in this relationship, then that should be a red flag. That, to me, from the standpoint of just what I see, in the realm of therapy, and in a lot of people who come to me for marriage-related advice, that safety piece is a non-negotiable. Everything else, that's the first layer. After that, we come to what people talk about, okay, what are the negotiables, the non-negotiables, and stuff like that. Really, that's a question that you have to ask yourself, because you have to know yourself well enough to know what your needs are. Do you need someone who's going to be very predictable and very, what are your love languages? What's the family that you grew up in, that the things that you think are a norm? If you need a predictable schedule, maybe you need a husband or a wife who's going to, have a 9-to-5 job, or, something like that. Maybe you're more driven and you want someone who's more of an entrepreneur, right? What's going to feed you? What's going to nurture you in the relationship? So a big piece of, looking for a spouse is knowing yourself well enough. The idea of the love languages, right? What is it that for you makes you feel loved and cared for and nurtured in a relationship? And look at your closest relationships, the healthy relationships that make you feel good. When you part ways with that person, you feel full emotionally. Look at what's going on. What is that person giving to you? Is it that they spend time with you? Is it that they compliment you? Is it that, you get to give them, when you part ways, they give you a really nice hug and that feels really good? Check in and see what your needs are. And that's one way for you to tell what is a non-negotiable for you in your relationship moving forward. Inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much. Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah, amma ba'd. My dear brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. From my perspective, I think one of the important things to keep in mind is our purpose of creation, which is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we're looking for our spouses, ultimately what you're looking for is someone that will help you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and get you to paradise. So that is the number one thing that should be the driving force in the marriage. After that, I think this concept of what is allowed to be overlooked and what is allowed, what is non-negotiable, this becomes very personal in terms of our own preferences, our own life goals and ambitions, and what we're looking for and striving for in terms of this dunya. So as long as you've prioritized the deen and you've made you've made the primary objective of your marriage to get closer to Allah and to get to paradise, then everything else, I think, is personally up to you to figure out and what you need and what you're looking for in terms of this dunya. So I do believe physical attraction is very important for both genders. I do believe compatibility is also very important for both people as well. So having similar goals in mind, similar objectives in mind, in terms of number of children, how to raise them, where we're going to live, all of those things I think do need to be discussed. So this is just a complement what Sister Menahal has already stated, along with safety and feeling secure. So I think as long, and this was the advice of the Prophet ﷺ, that if you always choose the person of deen, then you will be successful in this state. Now, deen has to be understood in its proper context. I think one of the things that has ended up happening in our day and age is that we've restricted deen to mean just knowledge of Islam. And that's not the case. The Prophet ﷺ, he highlights the deen and he highlights good character. So this ties in perfectly to what Sister Menahal was saying in terms of safety, that you also want to look at their character and make sure that their character is conducive to what Islam says, to your lifestyle, to how you want your children raised as well. Now, the latter part of the question, what if the person one loves and wants to marry isn't religious? Should the relationship be ended on this factor? So you have to understand that faith is something that goes up and down. It is something that fluctuates. It is not something that stays stagnant. So as long as the person has identified that they are willing to pursue this journey, if they're not religious prior to the marriage, give them some time to work on themselves and get to that state where they want to be. If they're going into their marriage hoping that you're going to make them religious, I would identify that as a big red flag. If you're not able to work on your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without your spouse before you get married, going into the marriage is not going to make things much easier. It requires self-discipline. It requires self-practice, right? So keep those things in mind. Now, if the faith goes down after the marriage, then we want to look at what's causing that. What are those external factors outside of the marriage and inside of the marriage that are leading to that state? And that's something that can be worked on. But if it's prior to the marriage, then yes, I would consider that a red flag.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. We can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Wala. So these questions are specifically addressed to Sheikh Navaid. So the first one is, what is the Islamically appropriate way for a woman to, quote unquote, make the first move?
So if a sister is interested in a brother, then there's no harm in making the first move. And we have to understand that there are cultural taboos around this. Even those of us that are born and raised in the West, it still is a cultural taboo. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that when your intentions are pure, and that's the first key thing, always make sure your intentions are pure, that they are for the sake of marriage and pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and protecting oneself. Then the next thing to do is to get your wali involved and ask your wali to approach this brother to see if they're interested, and then start the courting process from there, where you get to know one another.
Okay, and just to follow up on that, what are some halal ways of getting to know someone? So more specifically, is it okay for a man and a woman to meet in a public place or text or call in order to get to know each other for the purposes of marriage?
Excellent. So I think there has to be a gradual progression that takes place in the courting process. So the initial phase should be meeting with the wali and the families meeting one another to see if this is something that both families want and both parties want. And then beyond that, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what takes place. So man and a woman are allowed to meet in a public space as long as they're not alone. They're allowed to meet in each other's houses as long as they're not alone in the room. And in this courting process, eventually when they reach that decision of, are we ready to get married to one another or not, and they've made that decision and they get engaged, I would feel comfortable at that part, that is when they exchange text messages and WhatsApp messages at that point to plan the marriage and to make those decisions at that point. But prior to that, I've seen excess in terms of, both men and women, that once they start texting with one another, pictures come thereafter. We want to share our lives with one another. Emotions get attached even before the engagement period, and that becomes something that is incorrect and should not happen. Now, as for phone calls, I think that's perfectly fine. Again, along with the consent of the wali, if that is there, then they are allowed to call one another. Does the wali actually need to be on the phone when they're talking? I don't believe that to be the case. I don't believe that to be the case as long as that consent is there. Now, the most important thing I can remind myself and everyone else here with is the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. that with these modern means, when it is only you and that other individual, you have to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that third party, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears everything that you say, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's inside. So always keep your intentions pure, and always understand that just because there's no other human being there, it doesn't mean the angels aren't recording what you're saying. It doesn't mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't hear and know what you're saying as well. So always try to keep it as halal as much as possible.
Jazakallah khair. And just to follow up on that, so if one's parents disapprove of a person or a potential continually due to un-Islamic reasons, most commonly, you know, race, culture, what are one's options? And then who is considered a wali, and what order do I approach them? So that's kind of related to the question right above it.
Excellent. So if the parents continuously disapprove, and this is primarily the girl's wali herself, if he continues to disapprove based on non-Islamic reasons, then she does have recourse at that time. She does have recourse at that time. And what I would suggest is reach out to your local imam and reach out to your local sheikh and allow them to intervene in the process. Actually, sorry, let me change that. The first thing you want to do before you get your imam involved is try to get other family members involved and see if they can intervene, like your siblings, like your aunts and uncles. And if that is of no value at that time, then get your local imam or your local sheikh involved to sit down with your parents, explain the consequences of what can happen. And then at that time, one of two things will happen. Either the sheikh will appoint himself the wali, or the sheikh will ask you, who is your closest male relative from your father's side, because the wilaya generally is meant to be from the father's side. Now that can be very, problematic within the family, like especially if the father is no longer involved, his brothers will not want to be involved. Perhaps the sibling will not want to be involved. So it can be problematic. So that is why I always suggest let the imam or the sheikh figure out at that time who is the best person to become the wali. So if you've gotten the sheikh involved, let them figure out what to do at that point, inshallah.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Wala.
And Sheikh Navaid, just as a follow-up to what you said earlier, you've mentioned that, when you gain consent from the parents, inshallah, they could kind of call, meet in public places. However, how about if one wants to get to know somebody, but let's say due to race, they know their parents will not be okay with that. Are they allowed to talk to that person beforehand, before approaching their parents to see if it's kind of worth it, or is that like a no-no?
So I think over here, there's going to be a lot of cultural stigma as well. And that's what we're trying to avoid. Now, in terms of the courting process officially, getting to know a person for the sake of marriage is one thing, but getting to know a person, are they even qualified to get married, is another. So if you're just making that preliminary assessment, that is this person ready to get married and to find out more information, then I don't think it's good for them to meet in private in the first place, right? Get a sister that knows a brother who knows that brother, or find a married sister that has a husband to speak to that brother. And you can find multiple ways to make that assessment. But courting without the consent of the wali, even though it may not be outright explicitly haram, is definitely not the best way to approach things and to gain the trust of your parents and to show maturity and responsibility.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. So we're going to move on to the next set of questions.
Sure.
So these are for both Sister Menahal and Sheikh Navaid. So the first question is, what strategies are effective for individuals who are experiencing low mood related to wanting to get married, but not finding a suitable / compatible spouse?
I'll let Sister Menahal go on this one, inshallah. Bismillah.
Bismillah. So the first thing I'll say about this question is that, if a person is wanting to get married and that's, they're of age and they're looking, this is unfortunately all too common this day and age, and you find yourself in a low, experiencing a low mood, then number one, that's natural and that's normal. That's a part of the human condition. We want, we're built to have companionship, to have that, to be in relation to one another. And when that's not available to us, then it will hurt, right? So I never want to just shun or, push aside feelings that a person has of sadness or whatever it may be coming up related to not being able to find a spouse. Now, that's the first thing. The second piece to this is, taking some time to engage in introspection, right? Think about what it is that you need in looking for a spouse or in a spouse. And additionally, then what's the barrier in getting there, right? And, we have all of the advice that people will give to get out there, to, take whatever steps necessary, get on these marital apps and websites and stuff like that. But what I'm going to suggest is something a little bit different, right? So my lens is coming from the perspective of, from a therapeutic perspective, looking at what are the patterns that we engage in our life? What are the patterns that we developed early on in our life, way before we were of marriageable age, that impact how we look for a partner, that impact who we attract, that impact our own kind of, our sense of connectedness, right? So if a person, for example, has a very, a tendency to become over attached, or, we might say clingy, you might want to think about, okay, what's going on for me? What patterns did I develop earlier on that are causing that kind of an approach to a relationship, right? Or if a person has a tendency to shut down, and I'm saying this based on all the stuff that I see from the clients that I see who are looking for spouses who are really struggling, right? That have this kind of tendency perhaps to just shut down and be like, at the slightest whiff of disappointment or the slightest whiff of I might possibly maybe at some point get hurt by this person, they just completely shut down and say call it a day, right? So what are the things that are, that are barriers in your process of finding a partner? That's, taking, for granted the fact that you've put in the effort, that you've, looked in the community, contacted people that know people, that you've tried, give it a fair shot, right? I mean, for people who say I'm not doing the online thing, I can, I've heard enough horror stories about it that I can understand why a person wouldn't want to, but I'd say, give it a fair shot. So if you have given everything a fair shot, if you've put in that due diligence and you're trying and it's not working, it might be time to stop and say, not to place blame, not to say it's all my fault and I'm not lovable, but if that is a train of thought that runs in your mind, I'm a loser, there's something wrong with me, that might need to be addressed before you can go into a relationship and fully in a healthy way be present with a partner. So nothing, in conclusion, nothing will take the place of a partner. It's understandable to be sad. It's understandable to have low mood, to feel, let down. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, I find, Muslims come to me for therapy because of the, religious connection. And I find that a lot of times people start to blame Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we ask Allah's protection from that, but the sadness is understandable, but you have to take responsibility to find the means to, to the ways that you can get your needs met in the time that you're waiting. So that's the third piece of this, is in the time that you are looking for a spouse and have not yet found one, think about what your needs are. Are your needs to have loving touch? I know someone who is looking for a spouse, they've, gotten divorced, and with this person's permission, I'm sharing this example, she took up horseback riding because she really needs like touch, right? That's some people's love language. And without that, they feel starved emotionally. And so she took up horseback riding. She doesn't have a halal means of getting, touch from the opposite gender, but horseback riding is halal. And so that's something that she has taken up for herself now. So think about what your needs are and find other ways to have those needs met in the meantime, not as a replacement, because inshallah, we want, we pray to that you find a spouse, but in the meantime, to sulk and to keep going deeper into that rabbit hole of sadness is very easy, and we can lose our faith in that process. So I really, urge people to take up something, to figure out what your needs are and take up something that's bigger than yourself. Take on something that's going to expand your horizon of your purpose in the dunya.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much. I would add two things to this. Number one is that this concept of finding a suitable and compatible spouse is directly tied the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and dealing with the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I think it's a very valuable point that Sister Menahal made, that we never reach a level where we start blaming Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the two parts of this equation, as Sister Menahal identified, is, are we doing our due diligence and putting our best foot forward? And then after that, let Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to do. And when the time is right, you will find the person that is right for you. And this is why it is attributed that Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, he used to say regularly as a part of his dua that, oh Allah, I do not know what is best for me, only you know what is best for me. And this is very important in this discussion over here, that sometimes we become hasty where we want to get married right here, right now. But in reality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that it's not best for you to get married right here, right now. It could be detrimental to your deen, it could be detrimental to your akhirah, it could be detrimental to other relationships, and a wide variety of other reasons as well. So when the time is right, definitely you will get married, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So that belief in qadar and revising our iman in qadar is very, very important, particularly when we are struggling. The second thing I would highlight over here is also, trying to piggyback over what Sister Menahal was saying, is looking at the different types of love and trying to fill our hearts with those different types of love. And what I mean by that is the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and even self-love. And I think those two, prior to marriage, your self-esteem, your self-confidence are very, very important. And those two, directly tie into your self-esteem and self-confidence, that if you're not experiencing and feeling the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and if you don't love yourself, that self-confidence and that self-esteem will be very, very low. So with that being said, you want to look at ways of building your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and strengthening that relationship in terms of dhikr and dua and recitation of the Quran, and just trying to be the best Muslim that you possibly can. And then also in terms of self-love, practicing self-care and practicing things that will make you love yourself and make you feel self-confident as well. So those are the two things I would like to add to what Sister Menahal stated.
Yeah, barakallah feekum for those beautiful answers. You guys both kind of answered the second question, so I won't ask it. But for the third, how do you deal with unrequited love? So love that is one-sided.
I'll let Sister Menahal answer this one first.
My very biased response to that would be go to therapy. And, there's a lot here, and I'm assuming that because this is a marriage panel, we're talking about adult love, right? But what I've learned in all of my studies of trauma, and specifically attachment trauma, a lot of times in adulthood, the way that our relationships play out is that unless we are intentionally trying to change the patterns of our younger years, very often we are reenacting our relationships, our earliest attachment relationships. And so if we're talking about unrequited love, we want to think about what is it that keeps us in a relationship that is one-sided? What is it that pulls us into a position where we give to the detriment of our own self? And so how to deal with it, I would say, again, I say not so jokingly, is, it's something that requires a deeper look at oneself to say, what has my story been thus far? And in what ways am I repeating that story? Or in what ways does my story contribute to where I am now in this one-sided relationship? And then how can I then, once we understand it, once we develop more clarity on that, then we can be intentional in how to do things differently, to change those patterns, to hopefully, inshallah, lead to healthier relationships.
Jazakallah khair. In my mind, I've sort of made like a flow chart, and the flow chart for this question is, number one, is this something that always existed in this relationship, or is it something that started to exist? Then the second part to the flow chart is it perception or is it reality? And I think the part of perception and reality really ties into what Sister Menahal was saying, is looking deep down inside, that if this didn't exist before and it's now started to exist, what's changed? Has this person changed? Have I changed? Something must have changed. and then look deeper inside that in terms of myself, what are those changes that have happened that perhaps are leading to this. But I think one of the things to always highlight over here is, in the relationship of marriage, and I think that's what we're speaking about over here, is the importance of having an open and frank conversation. That if you can't have an open and frank conversation with your spouse, who are you going to have that frank conversation with, right? It is supposed to be the deepest level of trust, to the degree that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed, the veils of privacy, right? That you're allowed to be that person in front of them. So with that having been said, finding the courage, finding the right time to have that conversation and express how you feel, that explain how you're feeling and tell them why you're feeling such a way and how you think either things have changed or something else that has happened, and have that conversation. And you would find that that is a first step, can usually go a very long way. Now, along this journey, you may find that, yes, you do need external support, where perhaps both parties go to counseling and a therapist, or perhaps just you yourself go for counseling and therapy. And I want to reiterate that even though Sister Menahal said it, partially as a joke, the need for counseling and therapy as a preventative measure is so important. Like, we always want to go for counseling and therapy when the relationship is on the brink of destruction. We're at each other's throats. Let's go for counseling then. No, not at all. This concept of premarital counseling is so important. And even once you're married, from time to time, just checking in with a therapist and a counselor and just asking, hey, what can we do to improve our relationship, as a preventative measure, will go very, very far. So I know a lot was said, but inshallah, there was some value in it.
Excellent. So moving on. So this is for both speakers once again. So the first question is, what advice would you give a new couple to help them build a healthy foundation for the relationship, i.e., like communication strategies, things like that?
Excellent. Sister Menahal, would you like to go first?
Alhamdulillah, I can shorten my response because you just answered it. One of the things I would have said to this is the preventative measures that you mentioned, Sheikh. That's so important. I get almost giddy when I get people coming in for premarital counseling, because it's so important. Because, and I tell couples when they come for premarital counseling that I am going to look for the problems. I don't expect this to be an, oh my God, we love each other and we're getting married in a month process. I am looking for the potholes. I'm looking for the landmines. And I want them to be found here, where I can actually be a guide in helping you to figure out how to navigate those things. So that once you leave here, having had premarital counseling, you're not leaving here just knowing that you can, inshallah, get married with a little bit more ease of your heart, but also with tools to navigate the hard stuff when, not if it comes up, because it's going to come up, but when it comes up. And so that's the first thing what Sheikh Navaid mentioned is, the preventative measure of getting the premarital counseling. And you took the words right out of my mouth, Sheikh, when you said people come to counseling when things have gone awry. When we talk about the Gottman Institute, their research finds that people have been in turmoil in marriage for at least, on average, 6 years of turmoil, not marriage, but turmoil in the marriage before they get counseling. I've had couples come into me for counseling after over a decade of turmoil, not a decade of marriage, a decade of turmoil in the marriage. And then getting frustrated when 6 sessions don't suffice to solve the problems that took 10 years to accrue, and over 10 years to accrue. And so the preventative measures are absolutely imperative. Premarital couples especially, but my marriage, people who come to me for marriage counseling as well, the first thing you want to do is you want to educate yourself. We can't go into marriage saying that I'm going to do the things my parents did because they had a 40-year-old marriage. Their challenges, their culture, their, era was different. So much has changed. The mindset, the lifestyles, social media, There's so much influence in how we think and we feel about ourselves and our relationships. You have to be proactive. You have to take the workshops, read the books, to educate yourself, right? And find the sources that are going to teach you the skills to communicate effectively. Notice when things are starting to get sticky, and then right as soon as they do, get help. Don't wait until there's deterioration in order to get help before you start getting help. So that's, just as a foundation, that's where I would say people should start.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So if I would add to that, again, I would break it down to pre-marriage and post-marriage, or rather pre-nikah and post-nikah. So pre-nikah, I completely agree, taking those preventative measures, doing premarital counseling, understanding the psychology of the opposite gender, understanding communication styles of the opposite gender are very, very important. Likewise, understanding the way we handle stress and anxiety is also very, very important. Now, post-marriage, I want to highlight something that often gets neglected, are the sunnahs of the night of marriage itself, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam encouraged to pray together as one of your very first actions together. And I believe that within of itself is very symbolic of we're building our relationship together in our journey towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think that always has to be a focus in the relationship. So praying together on that first night and praying together as much as you can after that is very, very important as well. Engaging in religious literacy and doing activities together is also very, very important early on in the relationship. Now, I know in this day and age, one of the things we naturally resort back to is, okay, let's get onto the couch, let's watch Netflix or watch something on TV. And we consider this time together. And in reality, that's more dead time than it is anything else, because there's no real bonding experience that's taking place. So what I'm referring to is doing a new activity together that you've never done before, reading a book together, critically analyzing something like art or poetry or something of that nature, where you're engaged with each other's thoughts. So I think those sorts of activities where you're getting to know each other on a deeper level, particularly in the at the beginning of the relationship, is very, very important. And then last but not least, you need this reminder, whether at the beginning or you're a veteran in the marriage, is that at the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards you for every act of kindness that you do towards your spouse. And that has to keep, make a reminder of that for yourself throughout your marriage, that any act of kindness that you do, my spouse may not recognize it, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does. And at the end of the day, when we do things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspires that love and inspires that gratitude into our spouses if it is right for us, inshallah. So that's what I would share on that.
Can I add something to this?
Of course, please.
So just as you were speaking, Sheikh, I had the thought, like the suggestion to do new activities together is so great, because what happens is psychologically when you're doing something that's a little bit exciting, your dopamine, all of those like excitement hormones are going to be there that are going to actually make you more attracted to your spouse. Now, when you start doing these things, engaging in these critical things together, it actually builds the muscle of communication, which I know that's in parentheses, communication. So another piece of this is actually early on in the relationship, it's so critical to be willing to have the difficult conversations. If something is not going well, if you're engaging with each other in the way that Sheikh Navaid mentioned, you will be better equipped to have difficult conversations and be vulnerable in those difficult conversations early on in the marriage, before the pain has accrued, before the injuries have become insurmountable or more difficult to get past. And so doing the good stuff together will also, inshallah, lead to a better capacity to have the difficult conversations. And you have to be willing to do that. It's easy to overlook them in the beginning, but it's also easier to develop the muscles for having those hard conversations in a kind, compassionate manner early on as well.
Excellent, great points. Jazakallah khair.
Yeah, thank you both so much. So the second question is, how do you increase compatibility between two partners, especially in cases where partners are raised in different cultures and environments?
Sister Menahal, please.
So the thing here is, coming back to, I think what Sheikh said in the beginning, right? What is our purpose that Allah, with which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put us on this earth, right? And to understand what is the bigger picture for both partners. And because that supersedes culture and environment and all of those things. And so if two people can have a shared vision, who can develop shared meaning for their life, as the Gottmans put it, right? Something that's bigger than ourselves. What is it that we want in life, right? Our moral principle values. If those things, if people, if a couple can work on developing, being on the same page in those different aspects, then I think the other things will fall into place a little bit more easily. Allah knows best.
Jazakallah khair. So when I saw this question at first, I'm like, man, this is such a loaded question. Like when we're talking about increasing compatibility, does that mean that compatibility doesn't exist, or that it exists and we just want to increase it? So I think let's talk about the first scenario where compatibility doesn't exist. If you've identified that pre-marriage and you're still pursuing this relationship, that is a big red flag, that you've identified we're not compatible, but perhaps due to physical attraction, you're continuing to pursue the relationship. I would, stop and reassess, what I'm doing at that time.
And it seems really logical, but people still pursue it.
Exactly.
It happens all the time.
All
like
the time.
When you're saying it now, it's like, of course not. You wouldn't do it, but people do.
I mean, as they say, love is blinding, right? And I think that what ends up happening is that, that infatuation with the other individual just blinds us to reality and what the future might entail. Now, let's just say the second scenario where you're married and compatibility is already there and you want to increase it, then I think this goes back to doing activities. This idea of doing new activities actually came from something that I was reading earlier on how to build, resiliency in your child. And one of the things that was recommended was doing puzzles with your child, so that your child will be able to see how you deal with stress. And that's how they're meant to deal with stress. And then that leads to discussion and dialogue and what to do when you're frustrated and so on and so forth. So increasing compatibility, I think, takes on a similar role, where when you're both trying new things for the first time, you find each other's strengths, you find each other's weaknesses. And that's what compatibility is. A lot of it is about, that once you've identified those things, then you can work on those things together. And the main thing is, as cliche as it sounds, spending that quality time on getting to know one another is so important. Wallahu alam.
Awesome. And then how does a couple go about outlining expectations and boundaries with one another?
Sister Menahal, please.
The simplest response I have for this is, what I said earlier, is be willing to have those conversations. But with that being said, those conversations have to be had with a willingness to adapt and a willingness to compromise. And being able to listen to your spouse as to what it is that they're hoping for. So let's say, they say, I only want, I don't want to visit your family on, the third weekend, or, every single weekend. Okay, that might not be what you want, but to say, okay, help me understand what's behind that. Help me understand, what is it that you do want? You're saying you don't want this, but what's behind that? And to be willing to listen, right? Because if you've listened and your partner feels seen and heard and you've shown empathy, then there's going to be a higher chance that your partner is going to be willing to give you a chance to speak. If you just start pushing back right away, we think that we're going to push and somehow our partner is going to come closer and be more willing to engage with us. But we're actively pushing away what they're telling what they're telling us is important. And so having those conversations with a willingness to listen, with a willingness to adapt, and a willingness to, show empathy and compassion towards your spouse.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much. So again, I'd break this down pre-marriage and post-marriage. pre-marriage, I think it's a lot easier to have difficult conversations to a certain degree, just because there's no expectation of this relationship continuing. That, hey, if something goes wrong, there's no responsibility for this relationship to continue. So what I always recommend is, excuse the self-promotion over here, but I did a podcast with Ilmfeed on 10 conversations to have before you get married. And it talks about, the expectations and boundaries that we need to set. So a lot of that is dependent on knowing yourself and understanding what you expect and what your personal boundaries are, so that you can identify that for someone else. That's in a premarital stage. In a postmarital stage, if I was to look at this question, someone that's married is asking me this question. What I understand from the question is, I'm having difficulty with my spouse outlining the expectations and boundaries. What can I do at this time? And I think this is a great opportunity to use your counselor and your therapist as that mechanism, that get the help of your counselor or your therapist and just help you navigate through that, where each of you perhaps aren't communicating properly, or perhaps there's a fear of communication, and let your counselor or therapist intervene and help you set those expectations and boundaries amongst yourselves. And again, getting rid of that stigma of going to a counselor or a therapist is so important. And I think this is a part of it, that using it again as a preventative measure, that if you're struggling with something yourself and you haven't found a way to do it, get advice from the professionals, right? This is even a command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, that ask the people of knowledge if you don't know. So that's in the postmarital phase, that if you're not able to figure that out, then seek that professional help. And again, there shouldn't be any stigma around that.
Jazakallah khair. So these questions are for our sister Menahal. So the first one is, can you give advice on how to deal with unsolvable problems that come up between partners, i.e. those that lead to gridlock?
So that sounds like a question that came right out of the book by Dr. Gottman. Because there's a whole chapter on dealing with unsolvable problems. And so the first piece of this is to understand what's meant by unsolvable problems. Unsolvable problems are those that keep recurring within a relationship. This happens because of two people being different at the core of who they are. So for example, the easiest example that I think everyone can relate to is, let's say one partner is a spender and one partner is a saver, right? And so naturally throughout the relationship, there's going to be a constant, tension that's going to recur over and over, because one partner wants to splurge on something and the other partner is concerned about saving. And so how do you deal with that? Because this is just at the core of these two people. They're different in that way. So, what happens with that, and what the problem is with that is, it says here, those problems that lead to gridlock. Over time, the tension increases with these problems. And so it's really important, because over time, each partner becomes more and more sensitive to this issue and feels more and more attacked possibly by the other person. So if you find that you and your partner, you and your spouse keep hitting the same road bump, the same issue, that's probably an unsolvable problem. The way to deal with that, and this comes from the method that Dr. Gottman has outlined, is number one, to look at what the dream is within the conflict. And what that means is, usually underlying that issue, there is something much deeper. So for example, the spender might be someone who, they both may have come from humble beginnings, right? Where their partner and parents struggled or something like that. One of them may say, I always dreamed of being able to spend money the way that I wanted to. And this was, I wanted to grow up and be able to have that autonomy and that's a dream for them, to have this freedom to be able to spend, and this freedom to be able to, provide for their family and in a way that was not limiting. That might be the dream underneath. And for the other partner, the dream may be, I grew up with limited means and I always had to worry when, that we weren't going to have enough for the next month's whatever. And so saving is really important to me. It gives me a feeling of security and it gives me a feeling of stability in my life. And so that's really important to me. And so now that each partner, so that's what I mean by the first step, is to look at what is the dream underlying the issue. There has to be, and this is my, every marriage program that I do, my go-to thing is you have to be willing to have a conversation about it. You have to be willing to listen, put your own agenda to the side for a moment and listen to your spouse and say, okay, help me understand, what is it about spending that's so important for you? Tell me, what does it mean to you to spend? Like, what's the meaning that this holds? Why is it important? Is there a story that goes with that, right? So be willing to ask these questions so you can understand the significance of this for your spouse. Once you do that, then spend some time, and then you both, share the deeper meaning with each other. Then you take time to actually say, okay, how can we, and then there's a step, and and you can read about this in the book, but the next, practical piece of this is to take time to then reach some kind of a compromise. So for the spender and the saver, they might reach a compromise that says, hey, look, this is the amount that we want to maintain in savings. This might be like the lowest amount that we maintain in savings, and that amount helps me feel safe and secure. The spender might say, I need to have X amount of dollars, per month or per whatever amount of time to be able to spend as much as in whatever way that I want, because that will give me that sense of freedom that I'm looking for. So the dream underneath the issue of finances is the freedom to spend or the security with savings. And so you can find some kind of a compromise based on what the dream is. And then the really, really important piece that comes after that is to show gratitude and to appreciate one another when your spouse actually takes, puts in an effort, and you see that they're trying to help you reach that point of reaching your dream with this unsolvable issue.
Lovely. It just reminds me how the Gottmans say that most problems are actually those perpetual problems, right? And so it's really important to have dialogue. So the next question is how to resolve different conflicts. So for instance, one partner might have like their conflict resolution style is to need space, and then another partner might walk away. So if these two partners have very different styles, how do they kind of reconcile?
So this is, one of the things that Sheikh Navaid mentioned earlier was, we have to know our own, how we handle stress going into, and so actually this is something that I address with every premarital couple that comes to me, right? How do you deal with conflict, right? And understand, then we talk about, so the way that we do it is we talk about each person's individual conflict resolution style, and then the dynamic between both of them and how that's going to look, right? And so there are two parts of this, and I'm going to talk about this for, from the lens of people who are married now, right? So, because I see this, people who are married, one person wants to storm out the door, and that activates the other person and makes them lash out more, and it becomes a cat and mouse, right? So different, resolving a different conflict resolution style usually is this cat and mouse that we're talking about. One partner gets activated and needs that comfort, needs that hug, needs that warmth. The other person gets activated and needs to bolt, right? Needs to get out of there. And that results in the first person then feeling even more activated or abandoned or ignored or, feeling insignificant or unlovable or whatever may be coming up. So with this, number one, there is that individual piece of saying what's going on for me in those moments of conflict when my spouse does this. What do I need and what happens for me when my spouse does this? And then coming to the table, and usually, if this has been happening for a long time, it might be hard for a couple to do just on their own. It probably would be important to get, some support through marriage counseling for that, to say, okay, let's pay attention to this pattern that we're stuck in, right? Because this is a pattern. And Sue Johnson talks a lot about that, right? Let's notice the pattern. When I get angry, my voice starts going up. And so they might, before we get to the point where it explodes into one partner leaving and one partner shouting and screaming, we want to help couples recognize the kind of the preface to the blow up, to the, to that conflict getting to that point. And so one of the things I do with couples is I work with them on recognizing the pattern and saying, okay, I know that my voice starts to get raised, right? Or the partner, the spouse, the husband might, let's say, for example, the husband might say to the wife, and then He can tell her, so when your voice starts to get raised, I start getting nervous because I go into that mental space where I think that everything I say or do now is going to be wrong, you know, and so I just start to shut down. And she might, you know, and so it's breaking down the pattern. She might then say, well, when you start to shut down, I feel like you're ignoring me. And that makes me even more angry. And I just start to keep going and going and going. And all I need from you in that moment is a hug and for you to tell me that that's okay, that, you know, and this exact conversation I had with a couple not too long ago, where we said, you know, okay, when the spouse whose voice starts to go up, the other spouse should just put their hands on their shoulders and say, hey, what's going on right now? I'm listening to you, rather than getting worked up and walking away. And we want to do that before it escalates to the point of the partner walking away, about, you know. And so resolving the different resolution styles would mean, number one, know what you need, right? Do some work with yourself to figure out where that conflict resolution style is coming from, and what it is that you need in that situation. Number two, have the conversation in a calm time, right, about the pattern, about this kind of repetitive state that you fall into, and start way from the beginning, way before the actual conflict, so that you can notice what are the things that tell you that you're about to get to that point. And someone needs to jump in and say, hey, we're doing it again. We're starting to move towards a conflict. You know, and I worked with a couple on that recently. I said, hold on, let's pause right here. Do you notice you're both getting into that place where you want to prove the other wrong? And when you get to that space, then nobody wins, right? Because we completely lost sight of the actual topic. And now we're just nitpicking on the words that each one of you is using. And they're like, oh, whoa, yeah, we are, you know, completely lost the topic. Right? And so recognizing the patterns, but calling it out before it gets to the point of boiling over. And then taking steps, deciding ways to actually break that pattern, break that cycle before it gets to that point, finding cues to help each other do that.
Lovely. And then the next one is, how can someone change certain traits they possess that may impact their marriage, such as having low self-esteem, anger, shutting down when hurt?
I mean, we should know my answer to that, right? Well, the question, you know, the question that I'll ask is, you know, if someone finds himself in this situation, is what brought you here? What got us to this point of having low self-esteem or having anger or, you know, shutting down on her? Normally, usually, not usually, I would say probably 100% of the time, this part of us that shows up within a marriage is there to protect us. And it's paradoxical, because we want, if we, you know, these parts that are there to protect us, whether even anger, right, shutting down, they're showing up because somewhere along the way we learned that this works. Somewhere along the way I learned that if I think badly about myself, then I can put up with more criticism from the outside. And so even that part of me that says you're so horrible, you're worthless and this and that, that developed somewhere along the way to help me deal with my circumstances. You know, a beautiful, you know, a session that I had recently where we were talking about someone's fight part, right? Their anger. And we realized that this part developed at a time in life where parents were unavailable, were very critical, were very, you know, just not available for any kind of nurturing. And where, you know, this person who was a male who went to school, got connected with people who just, anger was the only way to be safe. And now in the marriage, this person, that's how they deal with everything, because the access to the rest of the emotions. So that angry part is there to protect a person from actually having to deal with any vulnerability, right? So the question is, how did you get here? Where were these things learned? And how are they helping you? It seems very paradoxical again, because these are the things that seem to ruin our relationships, but they're there to help us. And if we understand these parts of ourselves, if we pay attention to these parts of ourselves, then we can better navigate them. Then we can actually say, oh, I feel myself getting angry again because I feel ashamed. We'll find that a lot of times anger is there to help us deal with shame. Anger is there to help us deal with vulnerable parts of ourselves that we don't know how to deal with. And so if we pay attention to the anger, usually we say just push the anger away. No, but if we pay attention to the anger and say, okay, what's this anger trying to tell me? Then we can say, okay, I can deal with with the need that the anger is trying to have met unsuccessfully. But when we meet the need, then the angry part of us can calm down. And so the question I'd ask someone is, how did you get here? And how is this part serving you? And people usually get surprised by that. Like, my low self-esteem is not serving me. Yes, but it did at some point. And if we figure out how it's serving us, then we can work on redirecting it.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much. And so, Sheikh Navaid, these questions are for you. The first one is, what does Islam say about challenging or accepting cultural norms that may make marriage difficult for a couple? So, for example, gender norms according to a culture versus according to Islam.
Excellent. Jazakallah khair, Mahnoor. I just want to briefly touch on the previous section that Sister Menahal was speaking about. Like, one thing that kept coming to the forefront of my mind was the importance of subduing our ego in times of conflict. I think our ego kicks in, and we want to constantly prove ourselves right and the other people wrong at times of conflict. But in terms of Islam, controlling one's ego in times of conflict is very, very important. So I think that Islamic paradigm of conflict management is important as well, where we learn to control our egos in times of conflict. So I just wanted to quickly touch on that. Now, in terms of no problem, inshallah. In terms of this part over here of challenging and accepting cultural norms, it's a very vague question, and I think that may intentionally be the case. But let's approach this from principles in Islam. So one of the principles that we have in Islam is that matters of non-worship are permissible until proven otherwise, whereas matters of worship are prohibited until proven otherwise. So when we talk about gender norms, it's important to understand that things are permissible because it's a non-worship related thing until proven otherwise. So when I look at this question, one of the things I can understand from it is that perhaps in certain cultures, it's not normal for a woman to go to work, whereas in certain cultures, it actually is. So as you're moving around, as you become a second generation person, how do you navigate through those things? So the first thing you always want to ask is, what I'm doing right now, is it actually halal or haram? If it's haram, you stay away from it, no problem. If it's halal, is it the best thing for me to pursue? And this is what people often don't navigate through properly, is that just because something is halal, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's best for me, right? So you want to ask that second tiered question, is it actually best for me? And then the third part you look at, and perhaps this is where the crux of our discussion takes place, is how do we discuss those things and whose expectations am I required to live up to? So often there will be pressure from the spouse, often there will be pressure from our own families, often there will be pressure from our in-laws. And at the end of the day, you have to do, after what is most pleasing to Allah, what is best for you. And I find often in my experience with dealing with women in particular, they're very afraid to put themselves first. Perhaps it's something that they're culturally ingrained with, perhaps something that that they're taught along the way, but they like to give preference to their spouse, they like to give preference to their children, they like to give preference to everyone else. As long as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is happy with us, you want to look at, what is actually best for me. So what I would say, once we've figured out those three tiers of, it being halal, it being best for me, and moving forward from there, I think you should pick and choose your battles. That, we don't have to change every misconception that people have or address every single conflict that's out there, and pick and choose your battles at that time.
Jazakallah khair. The second question is, what is the ruling on a man demanding his wife to contribute financially with the reasoning that we currently live in a modern society that is more expensive and requires dual income?
Excellent. Jazakallah khair. One of the principles we have in fiqh is al-hukm ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi, that a ruling on the matter is based upon how you portray the problem. So the question over here is very, very specific when it is stated that the man is demanding his wife to contribute financially. So in this sort of situation, we want to understand that the default ruling is that the man Islamically is responsible for providing food, shelter, clothing, and necessities for his spouse. That is the default ruling. This default ruling can change if it is pre-negotiated, and can also change if the circumstances arise where a man is not able to support his family. Then in that sort of situation, it does becomes a woman's responsibility to share what she can till the husband is able to come back to that position. Now, what I would highlight over here is the importance of financial literacy. And that is, I think, again, we're talking about preventative measures. If we learn how to budget, if we learn how to earn money, if we learn how to spend money, those three things in particular can go such a long way in resolving financial conflict in a marriage. And I believe it's very important to increase our financial literacy in these matters, particularly before marriage, so that once you do get married, you are ready to go. So with that having been said, we understand what the fiqh says, but then we need to look at what is actually best for the marriage, what is actually best for the marriage. So if there is financial turmoil, we want to look at how do I help my spouse get back on his feet so that he can go back to providing and taking care of the family. And I think that's an important discussion to have as well.
So now, inshallah, Wala will kind of take over for answering the questions.
Inshallah.
Or asking the questions, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khairan so far. So, given our limited time, inshallah, for the slides that have both names, I'm just going to kind of assign them if that's okay. So for this slide, we'll start off with Sheikh Navaid. What is the Islamic ruling on living with the in-laws after marriage? And just to kind of combine that second question, if they're physically well and financially able, does the wife have the permission to request her own space and not live with the parents?
Excellent. So the Islamic ruling on living with in-laws after marriage is that it is allowed and it is not mandatory. And to summarize the answer to the second question, at any point in the marriage, the wife has the right to request her own living quarters and her own living space. That is a fundamental right that the wife is granted. Now, again, the difficult part is choosing between what is a fundamental right versus what is the best thing to do. And I love how the question mentioned that they're financially and physically well, because those are often the challenges. So given that they're financially and physically well and that they're not dependent upon their son, then I don't see any problem at all in terms of the wife asking for her own quarters and living space.
Jazakallah khairan. And for the next question, so how does one deal with toxic and abusive parents that are both abusive to their child and their child's spouse? So Menahal, if you want to answer this question, then Sheikh Navaid, feel free to add on after.
Sure. So with this, number one, if a person can't deal with this, then I would say, this is why premarital counseling is important. It's important. See, this is a hard question to answer, and I'll tell you why. It's because in this day and age, the words toxic and abusive get thrown around like candy, right? Everyone's toxic, everyone's abusive, everyone, and so we have to really be careful about how we use these words. Right. And, there's also a legitimate situation where people are toxic and actually abusive. Right. And so that's the first piece, is to really understand what these words mean. Now, if there are things where a person is, their relationship with their parents is one of like complete subservience to a fault. Right. And now they've gotten married and they don't know how to separate. They don't know how to create clear boundaries between their own family and their spouse in the cases where there's actual toxicity or abuse. Then, that's something that, pre-marriage, if it comes up, if you notice that in a thing, then I would say that would be a huge red flag to actually not move forward in the relationship. Post-marriage, then you're seeing that your spouse is not able to do that, then a person has to take it upon themselves to find ways to have these conversations, to create boundaries that are really clear and explicit. This is a situation where a husband and a wife have to work together to, to respect each other's needs, to respect each other's space, But again, I say that with the awareness, just because, you know, I see it far too often now that just anything that doesn't go my way is toxic and abusive. And that's a danger as well. And we want to really be aware of that, because, you know, for parents, as you know, asking something of their child that is at a time that you don't want it to be, or, you know, saying something that you didn't like, that wasn't about you, but, you know, that's different than maybe your relationship with your parents, which is very distant and just, you know, surface level formalities post marriage. It might feel intrusive to you, but it's not necessarily actually intrusive, right? So we want to have a little bit more clarity on this topic, and not just, you know, jump to everything being toxic and abusive, because I'm, you know, as I mentioned, that comes up a lot. So
I'll chime in very quickly. In terms of the daughter-in-law and the in-laws, religiously and Islamically, there's no obligation towards them except towards the spouse. So any ihsan that is shown is ihsan due to the spouse itself. So that's something to keep in mind. So any form of abuse that is thrown, they are not meant to tolerate, and they are allowed to separate from that relationship with no blame upon them. Now, in terms of the child themselves, and again, this is with the disclaimer that we have identified that it is truly toxic and truly abuse. In terms of the child themselves, I think one of the things that we're not educated about enough is what are the rights of the parents upon the child. And we have this perception that we owe unconditional obedience to our parents, when that's not the case. In the Quran, it is not mentioned at all unconditional obedience, except to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Obedience to anyone other than those two is always conditional to what is good and to what is best. And particularly with the parents themselves, if it's something that's exclusive to them, something that they need for themselves, then yes, we should provide for them. But in terms of it's something related to our life, in terms of what education I pursue, what job I pursue, who I get married, then at the end of the day, we have to decide what is best for our dunya and our akhirah. And we can consult our parents and take it as advice, but there's no concept of them being able to dictate what happens in our lives. I think that's very important to understand from the Islamic paradigm, especially when emotional abuse and manipulation comes into play. So that's what I'd add to what Sister Menahal mentioned.
Jazakumullah khairan. Those are some really great points. Now, Sheikh Navaid, this is addressed to you. And to kind of, your favorite question ever. And to kind of just put this all in one package, it's just, you know, the definition of qawam, what comes with that? What are some exceptions? Is it ever the wife's title, or is it just inherent to the man?
Yeah, you know, I think it's really unfair to leave this towards the end of the discussion because this requires a lot more discussion. Okay, I'm going to try to summarize this into several points. Point number one, understanding that leadership comes with great responsibility, and that as Muslims, we should not be seeking leadership within of itself. And this was the advice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this term qawam directly ties into the concept of leadership itself and to authority, and understanding that we may think leadership and authority is a good thing, but in reality, understand that there's greater accountability tied in to it. Number two is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has specifically mentioned in the Quran, الرِّجَالُ قَوَّامُونَ عَلَى النِّسَاءِ, that the men are qawwam upon women. And how we define qawwam is very, very important. I think it is so important to understand the context of what qawwam is and what it refers to. And qawwam over here is referring to in terms of those that maintain and those that rectify. So qawwam comes from qa'im, which is to stand up erect and to straighten, so that when something is going wrong, this person basically grabs the steering wheel and brings us back on track. So that's what the word qawwam actually means. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the ayah. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also explains as to some of the reasoning behind it. And there is this concept of financial responsibility in terms of the man providing for his family and taking care of his family. And perhaps that is why this authority was given to him. Then the third and last point is using power and authority as a mechanism of abuse and as a a mechanism of shutting the other party down. And that, regardless of who's doing it, is completely incorrect and completely un-Islamic. So when we want to dictate our way, we keep, regurgitating. And I really dislike using this word when talking about a verse of the Quran, but that's what it becomes. We're abusing the Quran for our own personal privilege. That should never be the case. So that's like the introduction to the topic. Now, what factors have to be present for a man to have this title? It comes back to taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and being just and doing their due diligence and knowledge of what it entails and accountability in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of those factors have to be present before this title can actually be used. Are there examples when this role of qawwam is not given to the husband? Yes. If the husband is not competent, if the husband is abusive, if the husband is not leading through an Islamic lens or paradigm, then this role and this title is definitely taken away. And at that time, we need to get a third party involved to resolve that and to figure out what the best course forward actually is. One point I will highlight over here, and I think this is very important to understand our scholarly tradition, that Imam al-Qurtubi rahimahullah, when he talks about this verse, he completely ties it to financial responsibility and insinuates the fact that if a woman becomes the sole breadwinner of the household, or she becomes the primary breadwinner of the household, then she has inherently taken this position of qawwam. So understand that as well. And then also understand the room for negotiation premarital, pre-nikah contract in terms of what you can include in your contract. That is also very, very important as well. Then the last point, Islamically, who has the right to name the child or final right if husband and wife disagree? I would ask, why are we getting to such a state that we're fighting over the child's name? That at such a point, if we have found a name that is from our tradition, meaning it is beloved, from the beloved names of companions, names of prophets, names of righteous women, at that point, why are we fighting over it? I think one of the worst things that you can do is making it seem as if your in-laws, and this works both ways, have any say in this. And I think that should not be the case. It should come down to husband and wife, and they both agree upon it themselves. And this shouldn't be a means of fighting and arguing. That if we find a name that has a beautiful meaning behind it, and this is who we want our child to look up to and try to live up to their example, then there should be a compromise. And I'm unable to find anything that says specifically it is the husband's right or the woman's right. And I believe this is from the beauty of the Sharia, that when things aren't mentioned specifically, it allows us to figure out those mechanisms for ourselves, which I believe is from the beauty of the Sharia, and Allah knows best.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Navaid. These are the other questions that are also addressed to you, Sheikh Navaid. The first one, can a husband threaten his wife by divorce or second marriage to make her obedient?
I would say, even if it was allowed, why are you digging your own grave, right? So clearly it's not allowed. Clearly it's not allowed. And I don't think anyone thinks that it's allowed. But when things become, quote unquote toxic, we always look for ways to get the upper hand and to emotionally manipulate people, right? And that's when this ends up getting used. But understand that I have not come across a single situation, and I speak very hesitantly on behalf of other people as well. But even people that I've spoken to, I've never come across a single situation where you threaten with divorce or you threaten with a second marriage that the wife becomes obedient. Clearly, there are underlying issues that need to be resolved prior to this threat. And the threat actually makes things much, much worse. So no, it is not allowed Islamically to threaten with divorce or with second marriage.
And the next question, regarding polygamy, although it's clear that it's generally permissible, what are some boundaries or considerations our community should understand regarding this topic?
And I'm speaking about this purely from a North American context, that within Canada as a country, polygyny, which is, favors the man, polygamy in general, is not allowed. It is, from the law of the land, that it is not allowed. So I would say, as law-abiding citizens, we cannot promote something that encourages breaking the law of the land. Now, if you're looking at this purely from a hypothetical fiqh perspective, void of the reality that we live in, or this is living in another country where polygamy actually is allowed. I think the fiqh of it is very, very important. And I would start the fiqh aspect of it in understanding the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where a man that does not do justice between his two wives or more than them will show up on the day of judgment split into half. And I think that is where the discussion needs to begin, where a lot of times we may think that there's just pure pleasure and fun, but we forget about the reality of accountability and responsibility towards Allah and towards our spouse. And that's where the discussion needs to begin. And then looking at what equity and equality actually looks like from a fiqh perspective. So again, I think that's beyond the scope of our discussion. Having said that, in North America, let's just speak about Canada. In Canada, it's illegal. You're not allowed to do it. And I do not believe it is something that should be entertained without scholarly consult first.
Jazakallah khairan. And next, we're going to get into, this is a few slides around this topic. So we'll start off with Sheikh Navaid. Can you please explain the commonly quoted hadith regarding angels cursing a woman all night if she denies her husband? And then the follow-up questions, which are, does this apply to a man who denies his wife? And what if they have good reason to do so? Does that apply still?
Excellent. So the context of the hadith is a woman that denies her husband intimacy without due cause and without due reason. So she's perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong. There's no stress, no anxiety. Nothing prior to that may take away the mood. So perhaps the husband may have been abusive recently, and she doesn't want to at that time, right? So the context is that things are normal, and then she's denying him for no reason. Then that is when the curse of the angels and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is upon her. Now, let us understand the reasoning behind this is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made intimacy halal with the select people that we have nikah with, and intimacy outside of that is haram. So particularly when we have been created with a bodily function and an emotional function as well, that shouldn't be belittled, and we're unable to fulfill that, then that creates problems and turmoil in the marriage. And this becomes, again, a tool of manipulation and emotional abuse that is not allowed. That is not allowed. So that is the context of the hadith. And I know often it gets quoted around that if you're not intimate with me, the curse of the angels will be upon you. And again, these threats don't improve the situation. We want to look at, as Sister Menahal has mentioned several times now, how did we get here? Why are we in this situation? And try to resolve those underlying issues first and foremost, and then take it from there. And I believe empathy goes such a long way, both ways, that the husband needs to look at, what are possible reasons why my wife is saying no, and the wife looking at the husband's side that, what are the consequences of me continuously saying no. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. I would love to hear Sister Menahal's take on this as well, by the way.
So we're going to jump into the next slide, and then I am going to address it to Menahal because the first one is around, again, the same topic, but maybe a different take. So Menahal, can you please speak to the common misconception that women do not have as high of a sexual drive as men, and how, just even sexual drives and them may be differing from couple to couple, how this impacts a marriage?
So to Sheikh Navaid, you spoke to the point that I would have made for the previous one, and I'll continue from there in terms of if we're getting to the point where either partner is feeling unfulfilled in this area, then we have to kind of ask what's going on underneath, right? And this issue that the question asks about women not having the same kind of sexual drive as men, actually I'm seeing more and more now that this is a situation where the wife says that she has a higher sexual drive than the husband. I'm seeing that more and more now. I don't know, I can't speak to any kind of, I haven't read any research on what the reason for that might be. I know stereotypically the notion has always been that the man has a higher sex drive. However, This can impact a marriage because of that stereotype, where people expect that the man is going to have a higher sex drive. When we talk about intimacy between a husband and wife, this comes down to the core. There has to be a conversation about it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made a husband and a wife, they halal for each other. And in that, the conversation, having erotic conversations, and sorry to be very explicit about this, but having very open conversations between a husband and a wife is halal, and it should be happening. If it's not happening, that is a question that we have to ask. If there are issues happening in this area, we have to ask what is going on emotionally between these two that's causing them to not be able to have this conversation.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much. The only thing I would add to this is, again, being very specific in terms of what we're speaking about. Sexual needs for men and women are quite different, and that has to be recognized. And the fulfillment of those needs and the process behind them is also quite different. So to equate them into one, I think does an injustice to the topic. So the whole concept of quality versus quantity, I believe does play a factor over here as well that needs to be addressed. Wallahu alam.
Yes, absolutely, I agree. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakumullah khairan. Sheikh Navaid, this next question, I think you already touched on it, but what does Islam say generally about the wife's sexual needs and satisfaction?
So I didn't get a chance to speak about it, but the general precursor that we gave is that any act of ihsan, any act of charity that you do towards your spouse is rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is one of those things that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned specifically, that even the act of intimacy with one's spouse, one is rewarded for. So I believe going out of their way to do this is something that is recommended to do. That, protecting not only our own chastity, but the chastity of our spouse is from the objectives of marriage, is from the objectives of Islam. And when either spouse is left unfulfilled and unsatisfied, then we're doing a disservice to ourselves, to our relationship, and to our deen, because it opens the doorway for shaitan to plant that seed that, hey, maybe if you go somewhere else, you will be satisfied and you will have your needs met. When in reality, we know that's not the case. So this is something that should be taken seriously both ways, and understanding that the needs and satisfaction of both parties is imperative to the best of our ability, inshallah.
And Sheikh Navaid, I believe that you touched on this a little bit, but for an example that maybe you can both speak to is that, a wife, due to years of emotional abuse from her husband, discontinues the intimacy with him. And then when the husband does seek help and he wants to resume intimacy immediately, the wife, is facing her own anxiety issues in his presence. So she doesn't want to seek a divorce, but she's not really quite there to engage in intimacy. What is she obliged to do per Sharia rulings?
Seek counseling and therapy. And this is the reality of it. Like, this is exactly, I think, what Sister Menahal and I were trying to mention earlier on, that why are we waiting till, we're on the verge of the relationship completely breaking down to seek help? So these years of emotional abuse prior to that happening, like even before that abuse started, is when we should have been seeking that help. Now, in this sort of situation, I believe it's important for the husband to be realistic, that the wife may have forgiven you and you may have crossed this first hurdle, but it doesn't mean that things are back to normal, right? So that has to be taken into consideration as well when discussing this topic. So I would say there's a point in time where you discuss Sharia rulings and you need to know what is halal and haram, and this scenario is not one of them. What needs to be done over here is a husband and wife going to therapy and going to counseling and figuring out together how can we resolve these issues to get back to a normative state, right? So I don't think the issue of Sharia rulings should be taken into consideration over here, but rather we should be looking at how do we get back to a normative state.
Jazakallah khairan. Menahal, would you like to add anything or just move on?
I think Sheikh Navaid addressed it beautifully. I mean, the only thought that, and just to reiterate what he already said, is that safety has to be reestablished. Intimacy is one of the most vulnerable acts that a husband and wife engage in with each other. And if you don't feel safe with a person, how can you engage with them in that way? How can you be that vulnerable with them? So it would make sense it would probably be a dissociated state for the person who's been abused to engage in intimacy. They wouldn't be able to be there mentally or physically.
Yeah,
if that's been the case.
You both raised really important points, and this kind of continues on to the next slide. Menahal, this is for you. You know, kind of putting the first two questions together. How can one encourage vulnerability and trust in a relationship, especially when, let's say, the spouse is trying to be vulnerable, but you're still getting hurt as the partner receiving that vulnerability?
So this takes, you know, that core concept of safety in a relationship, right? And it takes, again, I feel like these core principles, I keep kind of revolving every answer around them, because that's what it really, really comes down to, is to say, you know, what do I need in order to feel safe in this relationship, right? And so being able to speak to those needs, being able to, you know, because a lot of times we haven't taken the time to understand what our own needs are, right? And if we don't know what our needs are, then we can't voice them. And so that might be something to get, you know, to maybe speak to a friend about, go to therapy for, right? To understand at your core, what is it that you need? When you can voice those needs and those needs are being met, then there's going to be more of a capacity to be vulnerable, right? Trusting in a relationship, the other piece of that is that you have to be able to provide that safety for your partner. A lot of times we know what, you know, okay, this is what I need and this is what you're doing wrong, but we have to look at the flip side too. What are the cues that I'm giving off? You know, as soon as my partner, as soon as my spouse starts to speak to me about what, you know, hurts him or her, do I just start going like this? Do I start giving them like dagger eyes, right? Do I start like pulling away? Do I start giving off just in my body language and my facial expressions or my tone of voice? Do I become short, right? Do I feel so insecure that I push away the conversation? So we have to pay attention to the cues that we give and whether or not those cues are providing safety for our spouse, right? Because that safety goes both ways. And so if you're saying, you know, that your spouse is being vulnerable, but your feelings are getting hurt, then that might mean that you have to take a step back. And that's where Sheikh Navaid, what he said about the ego, we have to look at the ego, right? What is it here? Now, is it the way that your partner is saying it to you? Is it the way that your spouse is saying it to you? Does it feel like it's a criticism and that, you know, you're doing this wrong? Then there might be a way to say, hey, look, I really want to hear you out. But when you keep saying that I'm doing it wrong, it's hard for me to understand what you need from me. All I'm hearing is that I just keep doing everything wrong. So can you try to tell it to me in a different way, right? So that could be a part of it. If your spouse is really trying to say it in a kind way and you feel hurt, then that's where you might need to do some work and say, you know, where is my insecurity, or am I not able to hear, you know, that I have room for improvement? Is that my own hurdle that I have to get over, right? So that safety goes both ways, and taking a little bit of an objective look at what's going on in this interaction, right? If there's a fly on the wall, what is that fly seeing? Not just from what I can see my spouse doing, but from what I'm giving off as well.
Jazakallah khairan. We do have one more slide. If that's okay, can we take 5-10 more minutes of your guys' time, Sheikh Navaid, Menahal?
Yeah, bismillah,
yeah,
no problem.
That's fine. Sheikh Navaid, did you have anything to say about this?
A lot, but I don't want to open up that kind of word, but I think you did a great job. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much.
And Menahal, just for the last question, do you think we should be completely open in a relationship, or should some thoughts or feelings be filtered?
This seems like one of those questions that's meant to get me in trouble. Because on one hand, we say, you know, vulnerability and openness and sharing everything with your spouse and your spouse knowing your innermost self, and that's all good and well. But there's also such a thing as tact, and there's also such a thing as compassion, and there's also such a thing as, you know, as a filter, right? We live in a time where it's all about, I'm going to speak my truth and I'm going to say what I want to say. And, you know, and there's a place for that also. But we have to pay attention to when that aspect of I'm going to be who I am, and, you know, that kind of like aggressive approach, it's not healthy. right? And so there has to be a balance between that. So yes, you do want to be open, but this is not a black and white question. There's no black and white answer to this, right? I'm never going to encourage secrecy and stuff like that between spouses. However, I've seen situations where the breadwinner is like, not telling their wife or husband that things are really bad financially right now, business-wise, because they don't, and that, I don't think that that's healthy, right? However, at the same time, there's a way to have these conversations. So I don't think it's not about whether you should or shouldn't, it's about how you do it that's more important.
Such a great point. Thank you. Jazakallah khairan. And for our last slide, this is kind of addressed to both of you. Menahal, maybe if you can start us off, how can I support my partner, or how can one support their partner who has mental health issues?
So this is another one of those questions that's really sticky. Because the first thing I'll say to this is you cannot support someone who doesn't want to be supported. Okay, so if there's, in a marriage, the person who has mental health issues has to take responsibility to be addressing them. Now, when one spouse is taking the necessary steps to address the mental health issues, then you as their partner and spouse, you want to ask, because it really depends on what the mental health issues are, right? It's going to be very different if someone has, bipolar disorder versus if someone has depression versus if someone has anxiety, right? Or versus if someone has complex trauma from childhood abuse, right? These are all going to be different things. So if you want to support your partner, number one, they have to be actually taking steps to address the issues, and they have to want the support. And if they want the support, there has to be a very explicit conversation of how that support is going to look and how it's going to, what support is needed by the partner.
Okay, and for the second one, Menahal and Sheikh Navaid, if you'd like to add on, if a spouse is experiencing mental or emotional abuse from their partner, how should they handle it, especially if the abusive spouse is not willing to acknowledge their actions or seek help?
I'd really like it if Sheikh Navaid took this one first.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll just reread the question. If a spouse is experiencing mental health or emotional abuse from their partner, how should they handle it, especially if the abusive spouse is not willing to acknowledge that acknowledge their actions or to seek help? So the first thing I would say over here is that it's important to have our own support systems as well. So when someone is experiencing abuse from anyone, it's important to have that support system and know what their outlets are and know what their options are in the situation. Number two, from the Islamic understanding, there is this concept of la darara wa la dirar, that we don't harm others, nor do we allow others to harm us. And oftentimes we feel that because we're in a marital relationship, that we have to tolerate abuse and that Allah is going to be angry with me if I end up getting divorced or separated. And this has to be in its proper place, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gets angry when divorce is sought without cause. If you're being physically abused or very deeply emotionally abused, this is considered a just cause, and you are allowed to seek divorce after you've taken all of the precautionary measures prior to that, in terms of advising one another, in terms of getting an arbitrator involved, in terms of getting family support and getting others to speak to them, and so on and so forth. Number three, I think, and by the way, these numbers are in no particular order, just as the thoughts are coming to my head. Seeking help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something that can't be emphasized enough. That, the stories of the prophets are mentioned in the Quran in terms of the abuse that they experienced from their people, for a reason that even the best of Allah's creation will experience abuse from those closest to them. Particularly when we're talking about spousal abuse, you can think of the story of Ayyub alayhi salam. You can think of the story of Lut and Nuh, and you have these examples there so that we find solace in them, and that we always turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to seek help from Allah first, and then seek help from the creation after that. Number four is finding out what support systems, what external support systems are out there. So for example, if we're talking about eventually leading to physical abuse, the shelters that are there in the city, counseling that is available for them, and so on and so forth. So this is in point form some of the points that I would share, and Allah knows best.
Jazakallah khairan. And Sheikh Navaid, if you could just address this next question. if one partner is suspicious and engaging in spying, but does not provide any legitimate evidence or reasons for doing so, what should the accused partner do?
I'll share a funny anecdote first. But there's actually this app that if you download and someone tries to unlock your phone through the passcode, it actually takes a picture of them. So I've seen that actually used several times. But the point being, again, we're trying to address the symptom and not the underlying cause, right? So the fact that your spouse is spying is alluding to the fact that there is a breakdown in the trust of the relationship. And I think that's what we want to actually speak about, that what is causing this distrust? What can we do to build that trust back up? What can we do to protect ourselves from the whispers of shaitan that plants those seeds of doubt, and having those open and frank conversations. So one should never accuse spouses of doing anything wrong, nor should one accuse the spouse of spying, but rather have open and frank discussions. And again, I will highlight the importance of reminding each other of the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and accountability of speaking the truth on the day of judgment as regular reminders, right? And not just hearsay, in times of conflict. So that's some advice that I would share there. Wallahu alam.
Jazakallah khair. And Menahal, for the last question, in what situation is it acceptable for a couple to seek help outside their relationship?
Any situation necessary. There doesn't have to be a situation. But I'll say this though, to this question, I think that there's something in our deen about, that's so beautiful with spouses being garments for one another, right? And so I think that it's imperative to get help when necessary, but that help should be sought in a wise manner, right? So again, obviously I'm going to be a proponent of getting therapy and counseling, or speaking to someone who is knowledgeable, who is trustworthy, but also has, here's the piece that's important, that has emotional intelligence, okay? Unfortunately, not everyone who is in a position of authority has that, whether that's an elder within the family or whether that's someone within the community, right? That emotional intelligence is absolutely imperative in order to understand what are the underlying issues, because the black and white stuff anybody could give you advice on, but not everyone's going to help you understand what's going on for each of you within the dynamics of the relationship. And so, with this understanding of spouses being garments for one another, there has to be a respect that is maintained between partners, and also, seeking help in a situation that's confidential, that that if you do speak openly about things, that they're not going to be shared, or that you're not going to be judged for it, in the sense that you don't want it to get out, and you want to also present your partner or your spouse in a way that is honorable, right? But seeking help, I think that's from the sunnah.
Jazakallah khair. I think the only side point that I would add to this is that when we're seeking help, it should be from qualified people. Oftentimes, what ends up happening is we start seeking help from our friends and from aunts and uncles who are not qualified, and they're just there venting and sharing their opinions. So that in terms of the sanctity of the marriage, that should be preserved, and it should only be sought from qualified people.
Jazakallah khairan. Well, thank you both so much. That was our last slide. I do want to give you an opportunity. Is there any last or final comments that either of you would like to share?
Sister Menahal, would you like to go first?
No, please, sure, go ahead.
Jazakallah khair. So I want to comment on one of the previous slides in terms of that filter. I think one of the things that I would emphasize and highlight in terms of having a filter is, again, just because we're spouses, it doesn't mean that we're allowed to expose our sins to one another. So those are things that you should definitely keep to yourself. And if there's an addiction involved, please seek help and get the appropriate help that you need. Also, in terms of a filter, it's very important to keep the feelings of other people in mind as well. So sometimes you may be conveying the correct thing, but not in the correct manner. So that filter in terms of how you articulate yourself is very, very important as well. So sometimes we grow up in very sarcastic households, and we tend to keep that sarcasm with us as we grow up, and we end up losing that filter. So that should be kept in mind in terms of the filter. My final words of advice are broken down into three. Number one is continue to focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and your deen in the marriage, beginning and middle, and continue to do so until you enter into Jannah together. In terms of seeking help, it's never too early, nor is it ever too late. But continue to build on that and seek help preventatively and also in times of need. And then last but not least, the third point is invest in the relationship. Like just like we invest in our education, we invest in our careers, invest in your relationship as well. And it's I personally consider from a fiqh standpoint that any money that we spend on our marriage in investing in it, experiencing new things, increasing our literacy and education, this is all an act of sadaqah that you will be rewarded for, inshallah. So that in summary in 3 points is what I would conclude with, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
I could not have put it better myself, and I think that's a beautiful place for us to pause. Alhamdulillah, jazakallah khair, Sheikh.
Jazakumullah khairan. We really, really appreciate your time, and I know we went a little bit over, but honestly, this has been so beneficial for myself, and I hope for many others. So we really thank you for your time. We won't have any time for questions. I do want to thank everybody that joined us on the live, also here on Zoom. Inshallah, we'll be sending a recording to you or access to it. And then with that being said, a huge thank you again to our panelists. This is the contact information that they've graciously shared. So please direct not too many questions their way, but
I would just like to give the disclaimer that any counseling and therapy requests, send those to Sister Menahal, and any Islamic or fiqh questions can be sent to me, inshallah.
Actually, also my disclaimer is that I personally, my caseload is completely full, and I also cannot take clients from Canada, so I can try to help you find a Muslim therapist in Canada. But for counseling and therapy, I would find somebody locally. That's probably the best way to go.
Inshallah.
So for that reason, we have a little bit of some resource lists we quickly put together. Inshallah, we'll email this to all the registrants as well. There's the Khalil Center, which are doing web therapy. So if anybody's interested, you can check that out. Psychology Today is this really large database, and depending on what city you're located in, as well as other things like language spoken or religion followed. So you can filter your results and find a therapist that way. Also, Sister Menahal talked a lot about Gottman. Very well known, very well researched institute about couples and marriage. So they have a blog. They also have therapists that you can look and find one that practices from their kind of mode and from their perspective within Calgary, inshallah. So if you just go on their website, you can find that. Also,
Sister Wala, can I just add something very quickly on the previous slide? We just finished the Canadian Muslim Mental Health Conference today, and they're actually working on a map of across Canada in terms of mental health resources and counseling resources and therapy resources across Canada. So if someone goes to muslimmentalhealth.ca/resources, they should be able to get an introduction to it. It's not finished yet, but they've started that process. So that too would be a great resource in terms of looking for counseling and therapy, particularly within the Muslim sphere.
Canada, amazing. Jazakallah khair. I will add that to the list. And then just, Sheikh Navaid, you already touched on this, but kind of like our transitional home here in Calgary, there's a few also across Canada known as Nisa Home. So that's a really great resource for someone who needs that. Also a helpline for women. There's something called Nasiha Helpline, which is for youth and teens, and then just generally Access Mental Health, which is like an Alberta wide resource. So inshallah, we'll be sending you these through email. And last but not least, we would like, this wasn't a requirement or anything like that, but Mahnur and I, we collaborated with IIC. So here in Calgary, they have 2 massages, and they supported us so much in putting this program together. So if you benefited from this, and for us to continue to reach out to organizations like this and put these events together, then please do support them. You can just go onto their website, look at all of the programs they hold, and consider donating. So inshallah, this can keep occurring. So that's all that we have for today. Once again, I want to thank everybody for joining. I want to thank our panelists. Your volunteer time is so appreciated. May Allah put so much barakah in all that you do and all the efforts that you do. Jazakumullah khairan.
Jazakumullah khairan.
Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you so much.
Hope everyone has an amazing evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك اشهد ان لا اله الا انت استغفرك واتوب اليك والسلام عليكم